Buenos dias and welcome everybody to the Take Action for Puerto Rico press conference on this gorgeous day in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. We are here today to raise our voices, to join our voices to oppose discrimination against U.S. citizens who live in Puerto Rico and in all of the U.S. territories. We have a terrific lineup of speakers for you today. So without further ado, I want to begin our press conference by introducing Hispanic Federation's President and CEO, Frankie Miranda.
Thank you, Laura. I want to thank all our partners and allies who have joined us here today to speak out against discrimination. Discrimination against some of the most vulnerable and politically powerless U.S. citizens. For 30 years, Hispanic Federation has been working to uplift and advocate for Latino communities across the country, including in Puerto Rico. We have seen firsthand the neglect by the federal government and the discrimination which has directly contributed to the highest poverty rates in the country. Today, in the case of the United States versus Vaello-Madeo, we have a chance to right some of those wrongs. Mr. Vaello-Madeo, a 68-year-old man, became eligible for SSI in 2012 when he was living in New York. In 2013, he moved to Puerto Rico, and 4 years later, the federal government sent him a bill asking him to pay back $28,000 in SSI benefits. Simply by moving to Puerto Rico, he became ineligible to receive SSI. Nothing had changed for Mr. Vaello-Madeo, except that he moved to Puerto Rico. He went to the court to fight this injustice, and guess what? Not one, but two federal courts agreed with Mr. Vaello-Madeo. Two federal courts said it was discriminatory, irrational, and arbitrary to exclude otherwise eligible individuals like him from SSI, a federal program to help low-income, aged, blind, and disabled people with basic needs such as housing and food solely because they live in Puerto Rico. Furthermore, these federal courts said that excluding Puerto Ricans from SSI simply because they live in Puerto Rico runs counter to every essence and fundamental guarantees of the Constitution itself. The Trump administration appealed these decisions, and now the Biden administration is continuing those appeals by arguing in front of the Supreme Court in a little over an hour that Congress has the right to discriminate against U.S. citizens who live in Puerto Rico, and that it should be up to Congress to decide which constitutional rights are given or denied to people who live in Puerto Rico. We don't agree. Federal safety net programs should be equally available for all U.S. citizens, including those residing in Puerto Rico. The continued unequal access to medical, nutritional, and financial resources causes Puerto Ricans, especially the elderly, poor, and those with disabilities, to have a lower standard of care, service, and overall quality of life. It is not a fluke that Puerto Rico has both the highest poverty rates for adults and children across the United States, and has long been denied equitable access to a whole range of federal programs designed to support and lift vulnerable Americans out of poverty. These policies and this treatment by federal government has directly contributed to the poverty and suffering on the island, and that needs to change. Puerto Ricans were hopeful it will change after the last election because President Biden criticized the Trump administration for appealing the Vaello-Madeo federal court rulings and said he will ensure that residents of Puerto Rico have access to these benefits. When I met with President Biden at the White House in August, I appealed to him to drop the Trump administration case and cease arguing the right of the federal government to discriminate against U.S. citizens who live in Puerto Rico and other U.S. territories. Yet, his administration is doing exactly what the Trump administration did by challenging federal district and appellate court rulings in Mr. Vaello-Madeo's favor. While we recognize the important efforts the Biden administration and Congress to include SSI for Puerto Rico in the proposed Build Back Better legislation, we will continue to leave the rights of Puerto Ricans to the whims of Congress to pick and choose when and which rights to extend based on budgetary and partisan political negotiations. This unjust discrimination against Puerto Rico in SSI and other federal programs is rooted in blatantly racist Supreme Court precedents determined over a century ago. The opportunity is now for President Biden and the Supreme Court to finally right this historic wrong with a new legal precedent that makes it clear that unjustly denying any American their full rights is unconstitutional and undefensible. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, and the courts have ruled that they must no longer be denied their constitutional protections. The outcome of the Vaello-Madeo case will have a far-reaching impact on other cases currently being held in abeyance, in which other federal courts have agreed that it is discriminatory to deny benefits to otherwise qualified citizens, simply because of where they reside, while other cases are being stayed pending a determination. By fighting Vaello-Madeo, the Biden administration is fighting all of them. All plaintiffs in a case currently on hold pending this decision have said every passing minute constitutes an unnecessary delay for people who are eligible and in an urgent need of the most immediate participation in the SSI program. Even minimal periods of time without receiving SSI only causes further health risk, significant economic hardship, and constitutional harm. The lasting consequences of a negative decision in this one case on the lives of Puerto Rican families and children will be to continue to inhibit their ability to lift themselves out of poverty and to prevent them from receiving access to the same care and support as other low-income citizens. A negative decision will ensure that they will continue to be penalized by the federal government because of where they were born or where they choose to live within the U.S. In the end, this is not a complicated legal argument. This is simply a simple issue of fundamental constitutional and human rights. We look forward to hearing the arguments today, what the justices contemplate, the future of Puerto Rican, and the right to be treated fairly, and we will continue pressing this administration and Congress to do the right thing and finally end discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frankie, for setting that stage, for setting that context. It is not a complicated legal argument, in spite of what will be said in the court today. It is a fundamental issue of fairness. Our next speaker is Leah Fiol-Mata, the Senior Counsel of Latino Justice, PearlDeaf, and one of the amici in today's hearing. Leah.
Thank you. Buenos dias. Good morning to everybody. Latino Justice PearlDeaf, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, is a national civil rights organization dedicated to protecting the civil, constitutional, and human rights of Puerto Ricans and the Latino community. We are here today in support of José Luis Vaello-Madeo in this case of national importance, which involves the equal protection rights afforded by the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment within Puerto Rico. We, along with partner organizations, oppose the Biden administration's defense of what is, in essence, blatant discriminatory treatment against the residents of Puerto Rico by denying them necessary and often life-saving federal benefits, which they are entitled to as American citizens, and have filed an amicus brief in support of Mr. Vaello-Madeo in this case. Under the Social Security Act, Congress grants disability benefits to residents of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, yet deprives Puerto Ricans of those same benefits on the supposed basis that they are, and I quote, outside the United States. The rationales underlying the classification of Puerto Rico as an unincorporated territory under what are known as the insular cases are replete with racial and ethnic animus against Puerto Ricans. We believe the court must apply the highest level of judicial scrutiny to the classification at issue here, because residents of Puerto Rico meet the standards applicable to a suspect class. Excluding them from Social Security disability and other needs-based federal benefits is premised on a classification grounded in racist stereotypes, which are subject to strict scrutiny. The discriminatory treatment of United States citizens residing in Puerto Rico is premised on the insular cases, which were decided by the Supreme Court beginning in 1901, concerning the status of United States territories acquired by the United States in the Spanish-American War, including Puerto Rico. The cases created a distinction between incorporated and unincorporated territories, such as Puerto Rico. The Constitution would apply differently to those unincorporated territories. These cases have been heavily criticized due to their strong racial and ethnic basis and should be overturned by the Supreme Court. Subsequent decisions have applied the insular cases or their reasoning in finding that Puerto Rico may be treated unequally in connection with federal entitlement and benefit programs. While the Supreme Court decided last term in the Aurelius case that it did not need to consider the request of some parties, and I quote, to overrule the much criticized insular cases and their progeny, end quote. The Supreme Court should do so now because the ultimate basis of the government's argument is the disfavored reasoning of the insular cases. The court should follow the precedent set by Trump v. Hawaii when it overruled Korematsu v. United States as being, and I quote, gravely wrong the day it was decided and having no place in law under the Constitution, end quote. That reasoning and conclusion is equally applicable to the insular cases, and the Supreme Court should overrule them and affirm the judgment of the Court of Appeals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. Our next speaker is somebody who has become very dear to me. Aurelisa Puente is a young mother from the island of Puerto Rico, who I want to especially thank for coming all of this way, although we did give her a beautiful day from the island to put a human face on this. There are legal issues, there are statistics, but there are human beings who are being affected by these decisions, by these policies. And I think you will agree with us when you hear the story of one person, just one, who's being impacted, that you will agree with us that these cases are wrong, that this appeal is wrong and needs to be overturned. Aurelisa Puente.
Good morning. Why will I stay in silence when someone wants to discriminate against my miracle baby? My name is Aurelisa Aponte, and I'm the mother of a miracle, born on February 8th of 2017. I live in Luquillo, Puerto Rico with my husband and my two daughters. Isabella, my youngest, it's my miracle baby. She suffers from 7 major conditions, 7 major heart conditions that makes a significant exertion of energy by my little girl potentially life-threatening, being a prospect to a heart transplant. Doctors called her clinic scenario as an imperfection so perfectly designed that only God could bring her alive. Like any parent will do, my family sought out the best care for Isabella despite our limited resources. In total, she underwent a heart surgery in the first 21st day of her precious life, and the expectation of 2 more surgery awaiting, and finally, nothing else to do but a heart transplant. Everything changed when Hurricane Maria hit the island. just 7 months after Isabella's birth. This meant no electricity, no air conditioning, and finally, no water. With the island infrastructure devastated, we could no longer access the necessary care for Isabella ourselves in Puerto Rico. So, like thousands of others, we fled to Miami. Never in my life had I imagined the possibility to becoming a refugee and having to forcibly leave my beloved Puerto Rico because of a disaster. But my life and my baby's life depend on it. After 1 month in Florida, we received SSI, food stamps, and Medicaid. This federal assistance was a godsend for us as we struggled to get back on our feet and care for our family. However, I couldn't help but wonder why I had never been able to access all of these benefits at the same level in Puerto Rico. Everything was settling into its place in Florida. We also started working, but suddenly we had to come back to Puerto Rico to my mother's unexpected Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. Isabella is a warrior, and even knowing God is in control, surely she deserves equal justice under law. So, to the Supreme Court, I want to express my disappointment for not doing more to give the people of Puerto Rico the same SSI benefits as other U.S. citizens living outside of Puerto Rico, like myself, like my daughter, while we live in Florida. It's not fair that SSI benefits don't change if you move from state to state, but we are not able to receive it while we live in Puerto Rico when we are U.S. citizens too. Respectfully and with my heart filled with indignation, I ask President Biden to tell the Department of Justice to drop the case that is going to become before the Supreme Court. That will go a long way to get Puerto Ricans who need help like my daughter does. She didn't ask for any of this, but it's her benefits. End the discrimination against Puerto Ricans in federal benefits now. Thank you.
Wow. I'm very moved every time I hear that story. It just doesn't make any sense. Her baby no longer has benefits because she lives in Puerto Rico. It makes no sense. Our next speaker is Kate Lang, who's a senior staff attorney from Justice and Aging, also amici, filed an amicus brief representing the interests of elderly Americans in Puerto Rico. Kate.
Good morning and thank you. Thank you, Aurelia, for being here today to talk about Isabella and her struggle. My name is Kate Lang, and I'm a senior staff attorney working on economic security issues with Justice and Aging. Justice and Aging is a national nonprofit organization that uses the power of law to fight senior poverty by securing access to affordable health care, economic security, and the courts for older adults with limited resources. At Justice and Aging, we focus our advocacy on those who have been marginalized and excluded from justice, such as women, people of color, LGBT individuals, and people with limited English proficiency. And this includes many residents of Puerto Rico who have been excluded from SSI. This exclusion is unjust and discriminatory, and because of the high rates of poverty and disability, a large population of older people, and other inequities in Puerto Rico, the exclusion causes immense suffering for so many people, as we've just heard. SSI is important because it was designed to make sure that people over 65 and people with disabilities who don't have the ability to work can meet their basic needs. By definition, SSI beneficiaries have limited resources and depend on SSI for their survival. Justice and Aging believes that classifying a group of our nation's poor and disabled as second-tier citizens simply because they reside in Puerto Rico is wrong and serves no rational purpose. Excluding Puerto Rico's residents from receiving SSI is particularly harmful, given the island's high proportion of older adults and high disability rate. In 2019, the poverty rate in Puerto Rico was a shocking 43.5%, approximately 4 times the 10.5% average for the 50 states and the District of Columbia. Puerto Rico has a higher percentage of older residents than any state. People aged 60 and older constituted 26% of the population in 2017, and the older population is increasing. Like Puerto Ricans of all ages, a large percentage of the older population is impoverished. The percentage of Puerto Rico's residents aged 65 and older living in poverty is 40.2%. The exclusion of Puerto Rico's impoverished older residents from SSI is particularly harmful given the island's lack of long-term care services benefits under Medicaid because of inequitable federal caps. This difference in the structure of Medicaid financing for Puerto Rico has contributed to broader fiscal and health systems challenges, making the need for income supports through SSI even greater. It is a grave injustice that these substantial financial trade-offs are imposed on the low-income residents of Puerto Rico and continue to push Puerto Rico's economy further into a downward spiral. In addition to experiencing high levels of poverty, Puerto Rico's older residents have one of the highest disability rates in the United States and its territories. Nearly 1 in 6 Puerto Rican residents of all ages, that's 15%, are disabled, according to the Census Bureau, compared to 8.6% of the general U.S. population. Moreover, factors contributing to Puerto Rico's high poverty rate have disproportionately affected the disabled community. Nearly half of the island's disabled residents live in poverty, and that's twice the U.S. average. While some territorial residents can qualify for limited government assistance through the Aid to the Aged, Blind, and Disabled program, or AABD, those benefits are a fraction of what SSI provides and are an inadequate substitute. This system is not equitable, and it hurts older adults and people with disabilities in Puerto Rico who would otherwise have access to critical income supports. Hunger is also a huge problem for Puerto Rico residents. A study by the Puerto Rico Institute of Statistics in 2015 found that approximately 22% of adults in Puerto Rico reported skipping meals or eating smaller portions because they did not have enough money for food. And that was before the island's current economic crisis, 2 devastating hurricanes, and the more recent coronavirus pandemic. A 2020 survey found that food insecurity was high as 40% across the island. Puerto Rico is not equipped to meet the needs of its increasingly elderly and disabled population without access to SSI. This is unfair, and we must end this inequitable system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Our next speaker is Kimberly Sanchez Ocasio, Associate General Counsel of Seiu, Service Employees International Union.
Gracias, Laura. Buenos dias, good morning. Seiu, the Service Employees International Union, is committed to achieving economic justice and racial justice for all working people. And it has long advocated for an economically sustainable Puerto Rico, for our tens of thousands of Seiu members on the island, our members and retirees in the U.S. mainland who want to retire on Puerto Rico, and for all Puerto Ricans. Seiu is a member of the Official Committee of Unsecured Creditors in Puerto Rico's bankruptcy proceedings, but we filed our amicus brief, and I speak here today solely on behalf of Seiu. Seiu's members firmly believe that ensuring the provision of SSI benefits to Puerto Rico residents is key to avoiding needless poverty and to putting Puerto Rico on an economically sustainable path. There is no rational basis for continuing to discriminate against Puerto Rico residents in the provision of SSI benefits. Neither Puerto Rico's purported fiscal autonomy nor its unique tax status justify this continued discrimination. This is because, first, the island is not fiscally autonomous. Particularly under Promesa, it is not Puerto Rico's elected leaders who control the island's fiscal policy or who set the spending priorities. It is instead the federally appointed junta or oversight board. Second, contrary to conventional wisdom and under Puerto Rico's unique tax status, Puerto Rico's residents consistently contribute more to the federal government than the cost of extending SSI benefits to the island. Specifically, Puerto Rico's residents contribute $4 billion a year to the federal government. They do this by paying Medicare, by paying Social Security, and by paying payroll taxes. $4 billion. The cost of extending SSI benefits to the island is $1.8 billion a year. Puerto Rico pays more in absolute dollars than do a number of states that receive SSI benefits, including Vermont, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, and Alaska. When one refers to net federal transfers per capita, as explained in our amicus brief, Puerto Rico contributes more to the federal government than do a full 1/3 of US states. Far from being treated generously by the federal government, then Puerto Rico is getting the short end of the stick. Any fear of negatively disrupting the Puerto Rican economy is also unfounded. Extending SSI benefits to the 435,000 poor and disabled Puerto Rican residents who currently qualify to receive SSI benefits would have major positive effects on those individuals' lives. And it would also have major positive effects on the economy of Puerto Rico. Extending SSI benefits would lower the island's poverty rate by an estimated 7 percentage points. Extending SSI benefits would help stem out migration that drains Puerto Rico's tax base. And extending SSI benefits would encourage consumer spending, resulting in an estimated tens of millions of dollars in additional sales tax revenue and increased job creation. Ending SSI discrimination for Puerto Rico is the right thing to do. We urge the Biden administration, members of Congress, and the justices of the Supreme Court to do what is right and to ensure SSI parity for Puerto Rico.
Yes. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for specifically addressing some of the rationale that the federal government is using and showing that they don't have legs, that they don't make sense, and that they are unfounded. Our final speaker is Betsy Ramos. She is the executive director of MAVI, another speaker who came all the way from Puerto Rico this morning. Thank you for that, Betsy. MAVI is the largest independent living center in the Caribbean. So she works day in and day out with people impacted by the lack of benefits and knows too well the stories of people in need. Betsy.
Good morning, everyone. As Laura mentioned, I work at an independent living center that provides services to people with disabilities. In Puerto Rico, there are approximately 687,000 Puerto Ricans that have diverse disabilities. Our prevalence, as previous speaker have mentioned, is much greater than the prevalence of disabilities in the United States. In addition to having a higher rate of people with disabilities, Puerto Rico also has a higher poverty rate, with 44.5% versus the US's 26%. People with disabilities specifically have the highest poverty rate in the nation at 53.3%. This is more than double the poverty rate of the poorest state in the nation, which is Mississippi with 19.6%. With regard to food benefits, Puerto Ricans residing on the island with a family of 4 receive less nutritional assistance than those that live on the mainland with the same number of family members. Specifically, in Puerto Rico, they would receive $410 a month, whereas in the States, they would receive $642 because Puerto Rico continues to receive its benefits under the Nutrition Assistance Program, or NAP, versus the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is SNAP, and which is available on the mainland. The amount Puerto Ricans receive on the island are even less than what other U.S. territories receive under this nutritional assistance. For example, Guam, they receive $1,002 monthly. SSI is another safety net program that people with disabilities are denied on the island. Upon the inception of the SSI program, U.S. Congress chose not to apply this program to Puerto Rico and other territories. And instead, the territories receive their benefits under the Age, Blind, and Disabled, or the AABD program, which, unlike the SSI program, is not adjusted for inflation and has not seen an increase since 1996. Therefore, any person with disability that is currently residing in Puerto Rico receives only $75 a month under the AABD program, whereas if he or she were to move to the mainland, they could receive approximately $794 a month with SSI. Were the program extended to Puerto Rico, approximately 300,000 to 350,000 Puerto Ricans could benefit from this program, compared to only 34 to 38,000 Puerto Ricans that benefit from the AABD program because of its capped structure. This lack of medical, nutritional, and financial resources causes Puerto Ricans with disabilities to have lower standards of care, service, and overall quality of life. Studies have shown that increased medical funding is associated with a decrease in the prevalence of negative outcomes for people with disabilities. We are at a historic moment to improve the living conditions of people with disabilities and remediate the disparate treatment that Puerto Ricans are facing under federal programs and benefits. Let us help Ms. Ana Torres. She is a legally blind 56-year-old woman who lives in Caguas and has never been able to work because of her condition and lives under extreme poverty on the island. Her husband and her speak only Spanish and find it challenging to leave the island because they have no social supports on the mainland. So they must remain living in impoverished conditions in Puerto Rico. If they could ever migrate, they would leave behind family, friends, and supports that are vital to their well-being. However, if SSI were approved for Puerto Rico and other territories, they could improve their health, their income, without having to sacrifice their emotional well-being due to the lack of social supports. Puerto Ricans shouldn't have to choose between staying on their homeland with their families, with their culture, versus getting the food and healthcare they need to stay alive. Let us move forward with the inclusion of Puerto Ricans in the SSI program and other safety net programs that can ensure equal access to health and better quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betsy, and to all of our speakers. As you can see, the speakers represent a range of interests, a range of constituencies, as do all of the amici who filed nearly 30 briefs in support of Mr. Vaello-Madeo. Not a single brief was filed in support of the government's position. I want to thank everybody who came today, particularly those who came farthest, but everybody who cares about the situation of people on the island. It is unfair, it is unjust, and it is not too late for the Biden administration to change this. Even after oral arguments, the Biden administration can choose to withdraw their appeal and let all of the court decisions that are in place now stand and have equitable benefits and constitutional rights for people in Puerto Rico when it comes to safety net benefits. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for tuning in. And we're happy to now take questions if there are any from our in-person audience. Well, I hope many of you are watching online. We know that there are media in Puerto Rico and others who are watching. Thank you so much. We look forward to your reporting on the case. And now we are going to all go listen to the government try to defend discrimination against Puerto Ricans. Thank you again.
SSI for Puerto Rico.
Oh my God, that was